In the meadow, there were roses. There were crocuses pushing up through the grass in dense clusters, their petals the color of new flame, and violets low to the ground, so many of them that the earth between the stems seemed almost not to exist. Irises stood at intervals among the smaller flowers, their tall heads moving very slightly in a wind that was too gentle to feel. Hyacinths grew in the shaded places where the meadow dipped toward moisture, and their smell carried across the whole wide bowl of that open ground and settled into everything: the grass, the clothing of the young women who moved through the flowers gathering them, the air above the meadow that was already so full of color it seemed almost to have weight. This is how the oldest account begins. This is the first image the tradition hands down across almost 3,000 years of retelling. A meadow in spring, so completely and abundantly itself that it leaves no room for anything else, no shadow anywhere on the ground. The morning, neither early nor late, but simply and permanently bright. The young women gathering flowers were Oceanids, daughters of the ancient sea god Oceanus, companions whose names the Homeric hymn to Demeter records for the sake of completeness: Leucippe and Phaeno, Electra and Ianthe, Melitoniae, Rhodia and Calero, Melibosus and Tyche, Osiro and Chrysis, Ionera and Acestate, Admete and Rhodope, Pluto and Calypso, Styx and Urania, Galaxora and Pallas, Artemis with her arrows and Athena, the gray-eyed, those last two among the Olympians themselves, all gathered together in that meadow with the girl at the center of the story. The list of names is not incidental. The hymn provides it as evidence that this moment had witnesses, that the meadow's abundance was shared among companions who were themselves divine, that the figure at the center of what was about to unfold was not alone and not unprotected and not, in the world before the story's rupture, anything other than surrounded by the beautiful ordinary company of spring. The girl at the center was called Kore. The name means in ancient Greek something close to maiden or girl, not a name that announces power or carries the weight of a divine title, but a word as plain and specific as a season, a word used in cult worship and in poetry to mark the thing she was before the story changed her into what she would become: Kore, the maiden. The girl in the meadow with her arms full of flowers and the Oceanids around her, and no reason yet to know that the morning was anything other than what it appeared to be. What it is worth knowing, before anything else in the story is followed further, is who she was, not who she would become. That comes later in its own time, in its own way, but who she was at the moment the hymn finds her kneeling in the grass with crocuses in her hands. She was the daughter of Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods who governed the sky and the whole wide order of the cosmos from his palace above Olympus. And she was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess who held in her keeping the grain that grew from the earth and the harvest that came of it, and the slow, patient, annual miracle of a field moving from bare soil to green shoot to golden abundance. Between those two parentages, sky above and earth below, the father who rules the structure of things, and the mother who feeds what lives within that structure. Kore carried from her first moment a lineage that was itself a cosmological fact. She was not simply a girl. She was a being in whom the sky's sovereignty and the earth's fertility were already combined. A daughter whose very existence held the two great orders of the Olympian world in one body, one name, one figure, kneeling in the spring grass, gathering flowers that were also, in the theological grammar of her tradition, the children of the same earth her mother governed. Ancient sources are consistent on the parentage. The Homeric hymn to Demeter, the earliest and most complete account of her myth, names Zeus and Demeter without ambiguity. Hesiod's Theogony, that enormous and systematic account of divine genealogy, composed in the 8th or 7th century BCE, confirms the lineage. Pindar, writing in the 5th century BCE in lyric odes of formal and elevated power, refers to Persephone in terms that presuppose her divine status as entirely established. Diodorus Siculus, the historian of the 1st century BCE, traces her origins with similar care, situating her birth within the widest possible account of divine history, across 4 distinct literary traditions spanning roughly 7 centuries. The answer to the question of who her parents were does not vary. The daughter of Zeus and Demeter, born of the sky's authority and the earth's generosity. This is what the sources hold, each independently, each confirming what the others say. What the name Kor carries, beyond its surface meaning of maiden, is a liturgical precision that repays attention. In the religious practices of the ancient Greek world, the name was not simply a poetic alternative to Persephone. It functioned as a distinct designation tied to a distinct mode of worship, a name used in cult practice to address the goddess in her surface world identity, in her aspect as the young woman above ground rather than the queen enthroned below it. When ancient petitioners approached Kor in her temples and her sacred enclosures, they were addressing the maiden aspect, the spring figure, the promise of the harvest not yet fulfilled, the grain before it had grown. And this is important because it means her identity was always dual, always divided between the name she bore in the meadow and the name she bore on the throne, Kor here and Persephone there, the maiden above and the queen below, and neither name incomplete, neither aspect lesser than the other, both of them together constituting a figure whose wholeness was precisely that division, that movement between 2 worlds, 2 names, 2 modes of divine presence in the world. The scholar Walter Burkert, working in the 20th century on the religious practices of the ancient Greeks, traced the cult of Kore as a figure connected to the young green grain, shoot at the very beginning of its emergence from the earth, that first pale thread of color that appears above the dark soil before anything has yet been promised, the plant at the stage when the harvest is still only a possibility, still only a potential, coded into the seed and the ground and the long work of the season ahead. Burkert and the scholar Carl Carini, working along related but distinct lines, both argued that in cult practice, Kari was venerated as something more specific than the general idea of springtime. She was the precise figure of the growing thing at its most vulnerable and most promising moment. The shoot before it has committed to its full height. The grain before it has committed to its flower. The ancient worshipper who approached her name in that meadow season was not addressing an abstraction. They were addressing the visible evidence that the earth was alive again, that the work of the year was beginning, that the thing buried in winter darkness was now ascending. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. A field in its earliest spring, the grain shoots barely visible above the soil, pale green against dark earth, each one so thin that from a distance the field might not look like it has woken yet, might still look like bare ground, each shoot a thread of color rising out of the cold, and the whole field trembling very slightly in a low wind. This is Kor in her agricultural dimension. This is what the name carried for the people who said it in spring rituals at the edge of their fields, who addressed the young green presence in the soil with a goddess's name, because it was, in their understanding, precisely that, divine, delicate, already present, not yet complete. The oceanids are still in the meadow, the flowers are still in their arms. The morning is still the kind of morning it was when the story opened, unhurried, uncomplicated, full of the specific pleasure of gathering beautiful things in good company. There is no reason yet to leave this meadow. The tradition has given it to us in full, named its flowers with care, listed its witnesses with precision, and placed at its center a figure whose divine inheritance was itself as layered and particular as the meadow's own abundance. And so the meadow can be followed slowly. The crocuses noted one cluster at a time, the violets counted, the irises watched moving in that low and barely perceptible wind, roses, crocuses, violets, irises, hyacinths. The hymn names them with the precision of someone who knows that the specific flower matters, that roses are not the same thing as violets, and that the distinction between them is part of the meaning. Ancient commentators and modern scholars alike have paid attention to the list, its combination of flowers that bloom at different moments of the spring calendar, its inclusion of flowers associated with cult worship and divine festivals, its accumulation of sensory abundance into a single meadow that is, in this rendering, less a realistic landscape than a condensed image of every good thing the earth produces in the season of its renewal. The meadow of the Homeric hymn is not a meadow that could exist on any particular hillside in Greece or Sicily or Asia Minor. It is a meadow that exists precisely as the tradition requires, a meadow of maximum abundance, maximum beauty, maximum innocence, constructed with care so that what interrupts it will be understood in its full weight against what it interrupts. The oceanids move through the flowers at an easy, unhurried pace. Their arms are full of gathered stems. The morning holds. The quality of the light in that meadow, the particular spring light of the ancient Mediterranean, clear and gold, and not yet at its full high summer intensity, is the light of a morning that has been the same morning for a very long time and seems to have no intention of becoming afternoon. The girl called Cora kneels in the grass. She reaches for the crocuses. Her companions are near enough that she can hear them talking. This is the image the tradition has preserved across millennia as the opening of her story, not her arrival in power, not her throne, not the formal and sovereign figure she will become, but this, a young woman in a spring meadow, gathering flowers with her friends, the whole world around her, still in the state of ordinary, undemanding beauty that is the condition of the world before anything in a story has yet happened. The name Kori, written in ancient Greek characters, the letters pressed into the wet surface of a clay votive tablet by a worshipper's hand, the clay still bearing the faint impression of a thumb at one corner, where the offering was held before it was set down. The letters formed carefully, each one pressed with a stylus, or a fingernail, or a small tool made for exactly this kind of inscription, the name committed to the clay, with the seriousness of someone who intended it to last. And it did last. The tablets that carried her name in the sanctuaries of the ancient world were buried, lost, forgotten, and then found again in the soil of excavated temple sites, in the foundations of buildings that were built over the rubble of older buildings that had stood in the same places for centuries before them. The name in the clay outlasted the hand that pressed it, outlasted the worshipper's particular grief or gratitude or petition, outlasted the sanctuary itself in many cases, surviving as a record of the fact that someone in a specific year in the 5th century or the 4th or the 3rd stood at an altar with wet clay in their hands and pressed the name of the maiden into the surface and set it down. This is what cult practice looks like when it survives. not the grand architectural remains, though those survive too, in their fragments and foundations, but these small, personal, specific objects that carry the weight of an individual's relationship with a divine figure. A clay tablet, a name in letters, a thumbprint, the whole apparatus of ancient religious feeling compressed into an object small enough to hold in two hands. Demeter's grief is a long story, and it belongs to its own telling, its own time in the telling of this myth. What can be said here before any of that grief is approached is what her role in her daughter's identity meant in the seasons before the story's rupture. Demeter was not a background figure. She was not simply the mother who would later mourn. She was one of the two great divine forces whose union had produced the maiden in the meadow, and her domain, the grain, the harvest, the patient annual cycle of soil and seed and growth and abundance, was the material through which her daughter had been understood in cult practice from the beginning. The green shoot was Cora. The goddess of the green shoot was the daughter of the goddess of the field. The logic was precise and intentional, a theology worked out over generations of worship at the places where grain grew, and people prayed for it to keep growing. At Eleusis, on the coast of Attica, not far from Athens, the sanctuary that would become the home of the Eleusinian mysteries, the most significant and long-lasting mystery cult of the ancient Greek world, had at its center the story of Demeter and Cork, the mother who loses her daughter and the maiden who descends. The sanctuary stood for over 1,000 years. The rites performed in it were secret, held at night, open only to initiates who had been formally admitted, and what happened inside was never written down in any form that has survived. What survived is the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which ancient scholars believe to be in some relationship with those rites, perhaps derived from them, perhaps used in preparation for them, perhaps simply existing in the same tradition that had produced them. The hymn and the mysteries were not the same thing, but they circled the same story, returned again and again to the same figure in the same meadow with the same flowers, as though the act of retelling was itself a kind of approach to whatever the secret thing was that the rites kept private. Kore in the spring, Kore with the crocuses, Kore, whose name would become Persephone when the story turned, the maiden who would become a queen, the girl in the meadow who was already, in her lineage and her cult and the theological grammar of her tradition, much more than the springtime figure she appeared to be. The sanctuary at Enna occupies a plateau in the interior of Sicily, positioned so high above the surrounding plain that the land drops away on every side, and the whole wide Sicilian landscape is visible from its edge for miles in every direction. Ancient writers identified Enna, its plateau, its meadows, its particular quality of being both central to Sicily and apart from the ordinary level of the world, as the location of the meadow where the story happened, the place where the earth opened and the maiden descended. The plateau was, in ancient testimony, a place of extraordinary natural beauty, its surface in spring covered with exactly the kind of flower abundance the hymn describes, and the height of it above the surrounding country gave it the quality of a threshold, a place that was above the world, in one sense, and yet was itself the skin of the earth, the surface beneath which the depths ran. Ancient pilgrims came to Enna. The sanctuary that stood there was considered significant enough to survive for centuries. The identification of the site with the myth was not a late literary invention, but an ancient tradition rooted in local cult practice, in the worship of Demeter and corn that the communities of Sicily had sustained long before any poet wrote the myth down in the form it now survives. To stand on the plateau at Enna and look out across the Sicilian plain would be, in the ancient understanding, to stand at the edge of the story's central event, to stand where the meadow was, where the flowers were, where the morning held its brightness, and the young women gathered their stems, and the earth below, in the depths far below the soil of the plateau, was already arranged in all its rivers and halls and sovereign courts and specific geography, already fully itself, already waiting. The plateau at Enna is a place where the surface of the world is also a threshold to what is below it. The ancient identification of the site makes this visible, the meadow above, the realm below, and the figure who would move between them, born into a lineage that made her the daughter of both. What is preserved from the cult sites of the ancient Greek world, in the archaeological record that excavation has produced across the last 2 centuries, is a picture of Persephone's worship that does not always match the literary record, that in some ways predates it, supplements it, and in some cases complicates it in interesting ways. The terracotta plaques found at Locria Persephone, a Greek colonial city in the toe of the Italian peninsula, founded in the 7th century BCE, belong to this category of evidence. The site has produced a significant body of pinaques, votive plaques made of terracotta, fired and painted, deposited at the sanctuary as offerings to the goddess, that date primarily from the 5th century BCE, and depict scenes from the myth of Persephone and from the wider religious culture of her worship. Among these plaques, a particular group stands out. These are the images in which Persephone appears, not as the maiden gathering flowers, not as Corrie in the meadow, not in the pastoral pre-abduction identity that the Homeric hymn establishes as the myth's beginning, but as a queen, a seated female figure in formal posture, a scepter resting across her lap, her expression composed and authoritative. Sometimes Hades sits beside her in an equivalent posture of sovereignty. The composition is formal in the way that official images of rulers are formal, not a scene from a story, but a statement of status, a visual record of power exercised and recognized. The figure on the throne is not being observed in a narrative moment. She is being observed in her permanent condition of sovereignty over a realm. These plaques are small enough to hold in 2 hands. They are worn smooth at the edges by centuries of handling before they were buried in the sanctuary's deposits, smoothed by the hands of the worshippers who carried them to the altar and set them down with whatever prayer or petition or expression of gratitude accompanied the offering. The paint on the surviving examples has faded to a memory of color, the details of the faces visible, but not vivid, the scepter clear in its position across the figure's lap, but reduced to an outline, the throne indicated rather than depicted in full. And yet the composition's meaning is entirely legible. The figure on the throne is a sovereign, the expression on the face is authoritative. The posture does not invite approach on familiar terms. This is a queen receiving an offering in her court, not a maiden gathering flowers in a meadow. The significance of this is worth holding. The Locrian pinaques date from the 5th century BCE, the same century in which many of the great literary elaborations of the Persephone myth were being composed, the same century in which the Eleusinian mysteries were at the height of their cultural significance, the same century in which the myth was being told, retold, refined, and argued over in the literary and philosophical culture of the Greek world, and in the religious practice of the community at Locri, a community of worshippers who had been honoring Persephone at this sanctuary for generations. The image they chose to commit to clay and carry to the altar was not the maiden in the meadow, it was the queen on the throne. Her sovereignty in the realm below was not, for this community, something that required the narrative of the abduction and the descent to establish. It was simply what she was. It was the thing they approached when they approached her. It was the figure they held in their hands as they carried the offering to the sanctuary and set it down. This means that the story of the abduction, the meadow, the flowers, the sudden rupture, the descent, is from one angle an account of how Persephone came to be queen. But from another angle, the evidence of cult practice suggests that her queenship was prior, was established, was in some forms of worship, simply the condition of the figure rather than the consequence of a narrative event. The worshipper at Lockery, who pressed the clay into a mold and produced a plaque showing a woman on a throne with a scepter across her lap, was not thinking primarily about the story of how she got there. They were thinking about the queen herself, the sovereign figure to whom they were bringing their petition, the divine power whose authority over the realm of the dead was a fact that needed no story to establish it, because it was simply, directly, exactly what she was. The green shoots in the field, the name in the clay, the queen on the throne. Each of these is a way of seeing the same figure, a way of approaching the same divine presence from a different angle, in a different season, with a different need. The worshipper who came to Korah's sanctuary in spring, at the edge of the fields with the grain just barely visible above the soil, was approaching the promise of abundance, the delicate and as yet unfulfilled potential of a good harvest. The worshipper who came to the Locrian sanctuary with a terracotta plaque in their hands was approaching the sovereign of death, the queen whose authority over what happened to the souls of the dead was not decorative or symbolic, but operative, real, the kind of authority to which petitions could be addressed, and from which genuine answers might come. Both of these figures are Persephone. Both of these figures were from the beginning present in her, the lineage that made her the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, sky and earth, authority and fertility, the structure of the cosmos, and the generative abundance within it, encoded both capacities into her divine identity before any story had yet been told, before the meadow had yet been interrupted, before any name had changed. She was Kor, the maiden, the green shoot, the promise. She was also already the queen, whose figure the Locrian worshippers recognized when they pressed her image into wet clay and held it in their hands before setting it down. A field in its earliest spring, the soil still dark and cold, the shoots so pale and thin that from a distance they are barely visible, each one a thread of color rising out of the earth with all the patience of something that has done this before and knows the season well enough to trust it. A thumbprint in the corner of a votive tablet where the worshipper held it before they set it down. A meadow on a plateau in Sicily where the land drops away on all sides and the plain stretches for miles in every direction. A list of flowers, roses, crocuses, violets, irises, hyacinths. A list of names, Leucippe, Phano, Electra, Ianthe, all the oceanids moving through the spring morning with their arms full of gathered stems. These are the materials that tradition provides for the beginning of the story, and the beginning is worth taking slowly, worth following from the meadow's first flower to its last, worth attending to the specific quality of a morning that is still entirely itself, before the story has moved forward into what happens next. The tradition gives the meadow in full. It gives the flowers by name, the companions by name, the quality of the morning, with enough care that the morning can still be felt across 3,000 years of retelling. A meadow in permanent, uncomplicated spring. A young woman kneeling in the grass. A divine inheritance already enormous, before any of what comes next has yet arrived. Somewhere in the 5th century BCE, a worshipper at Locri Epicepheri stood at the sanctuary with a small terracotta plaque in both hands. The clay had been pressed into a mold and fired and painted, and on its surface was an image of a woman on a throne, her posture formal, her expression composed, the scepter across her lap, resting as though it had always been there, as though the throne and the figure on it had always been exactly as they were. The worshipper set the plaque down. The sanctuary continued its business, its smoke and its prayers, and its steady accumulation of offerings from the community that had sustained it for generations. The plaque was eventually buried, either by deliberate deposition or by the slow accumulation of time, and it remained in the earth for 2 millennia and more before excavation brought it to the surface again. In the clay, when the plaque is examined closely, the queen on the throne is still clearly visible. The worn edges where the worshipper's hands smoothed the surface over decades or minutes, or the single ceremony of carrying it to the altar, those worn edges are still there. The scepter is still across her lap. The expression on the face is still composed, still authoritative, still the expression of someone who has been in authority for a very long time and expects to remain in it. A queen already enthroned in clay by a worshipper's hand in the 5th century before the Common Era, the image committed to the earth long before most of the stories that would explain her crowning had been written down in any form that survives. The plaque rests in the earth where it was left. The queen is still on the throne. The Homeric hymn to Demeter begins in a meadow. It opens not with gods deliberating on Olympus, not with the machinery of divine arrangement, but with flowers, with the specific, unhurried abundance of a particular afternoon in a place where spring has been allowed to accumulate without interruption. The hymn is 495 lines long. It has survived in a single manuscript, and that manuscript was found in Moscow in the year 1777, collected into a volume of miscellaneous ancient texts, whose compiler may not have understood what he held. Before that discovery, the hymn had been effectively lost to the modern world for centuries, and yet the meadow it opens with feels entirely undisturbed by its long absence. The roses are still there, the crocuses still pressed thickly against the ground, the violets still spreading their color across a surface that has no interest in moving anywhere. The poem was composed, scholars believe, sometime in the 7th or 6th century BCE, though the tradition it encodes is almost certainly older than the poem itself. It served, in the ancient world, a function that was more than literary. The hymn is understood to have had a quasi-liturgical relationship with the Eleusinian mysteries, those celebrated, fiercely private religious rites conducted each year at the sanctuary of Eleusis west of Athens, whose central content was never written down, and whose initiates took oaths of silence they appear to have kept. What was enacted at Eleusis each autumn, what the initiates witnessed in the great hall of the Telesterion by torchlight, has been the subject of scholarly speculation for centuries without arriving at certainty. What remains is the hymn, 495 lines of verse that begin with a maiden in a meadow and a very particular flower, and that carry underneath their narrative surface the weight of something the ancient world considered sacred enough to protect with silence. The flowers in the opening of the hymn are named one by one. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the naming of them is not incidental. Roses, crocuses, violets, irises, hyacinths. The poet lists them with the deliberate attention of someone who wants the listener to feel the density of the place, the way blossoms were pressing against each other across a surface that had been producing them without restraint. The oceanid nymphs are there, the daughters of the great ocean-encircling river Oceanus, moving through the same abundance with their arms gathering stems. The scene is constructed with care, by an ancient hand, to feel complete in itself, a world sufficiently full of ordinary beauty, that the thing about to happen to it will be felt as rupture rather than background noise. The hymn knows what it is doing. It gives the meadow time. Kore is there among the nymphs. Kor, the name that means simply maiden or girl, a name that carries in its two syllables the whole weight of a state of being that precedes whatever comes next. In the cult worship of the ancient Greek world, the name Kore was used interchangeably with Persephone to mark her surface world identity, her identity as daughter and promise rather than queen and sovereign. Before the earth opened, she was Kore. After, she would hold both names simultaneously, Kore for what she had been, Persephone for what she had become. But in the first lines of the hymn, she is still only the maiden, her arms full of blossoms, moving through a meadow that has every reason in the world to believe itself permanent. And then there is a particular flower, not the roses, not the crocuses, something set apart from all the rest of the meadow's ordinary abundance, something whose description in the hymn marks it as different in kind from what surrounds it. The narcissus, standing at the meadow's edge, remarkable in its fragrance, described in the text as extraordinary, as something placed there specifically, as something that had not arrived there by the ordinary processes of spring. Ancient commentators noted the word's connection to narc, the Greek for torpor, for the specific heaviness that comes over the senses before they go quiet. Narc is the same root from which the word narcotic eventually descended. The narcissus in the hymn carries that etymology in its name, even before the flower does anything, before Kor reaches for it, before anything at all has yet happened. The flower is a threshold disguised as an object of beauty, and the meadow, which has been so carefully and so generously described, does not know this. The hymn is explicit about who arranged it. Gaia, the earth herself, grew the narcissus at the request of Zeus. Zeus had made an agreement with Hades. Persephone was to become the wife of the Lord of the Dead, the queen of the realm below. This arrangement had been made without consulting Demeter, without informing her. The agreement was held between three parties: Zeus, who consented, Hades, who would receive, and Gaia, who cooperated with the Earth's own mechanisms to place the lure, and none of them saw fit to bring Demeter into the conversation. This is how the hymn frames the event. Not as lawlessness, not as random violence visited on an innocent by a god with unchecked power, but as a structured arrangement among divine powers that had, between them, decided how the world would be reorganized. The arrangement had prior sanction. It had a form. It had, in the understanding of the ancient tradition that produced this text, a kind of cosmic legitimacy that does not require modern approval and was not designed to seek it. On Olympus, or wherever it was that Zeus kept his attention, in the moment the arrangement was unfolding, the king of the gods was not watching the meadow. The rest of the divine assembly was engaged in whatever ordinarily occupied a divine assembly, in the bright air of the upper world, the affairs of mortals, the management of thunder and weather, and the operations of fate. Far below, in a flower-covered field at a location the hymn calls the plain of Nysa, Kore was moving toward the narcissus. The gap between those two worlds, the bright assembly above, the meadow below, was enormous, and the flower was waiting at its edge. The plain of Nysa, the Nysian Pedion. Ancient scholars spent considerable effort trying to locate it on a map, and they disagreed in the way that scholars disagreed when the thing they were looking for had a habit of not staying in one place. Some sources placed Nysa in Boeotia, in the interior of Greece, among the cultivated hills north of Athens. Some placed it in Arcadia, the wild central region of the Peloponnese. Others argued for Sicily, the great island to the west of Greece, or the sanctuary at Enna sits on a high inland plateau with the plain visible for miles in every direction, the site described by ancient writers, including Diodorus Siculus and Cicero, as the very location where the earth had opened. Others still located Nyssa in Asia Minor, farther east, in the territories that lay beyond the comfortable reach of the Greek mainland. The name persisted for centuries on ancient maps that could never quite agree on where it was, a meadow that existed in the tradition with complete conviction and on the ground with none at all, a place that was everywhere the story needed it to be and nowhere a traveler could arrive. The location of the Narcissus was Nyssa, and Nyssa was wherever the ground was thin. The Narcissus then, standing alone at the meadow's edge, or perhaps among the other flowers, but distinct from them in a way the hymn registers as significant, in its fragrance, in its quality of drawing the attention toward itself and away from everything surrounding it. The surrounding meadow, described at such length and with such evident pleasure in the poem's opening lines, would have seemed, in the vicinity of the Narcissus, to recede slightly, the roses and hyacinths and violets still present, still real, but somehow less demanding of attention than this single flower with its particular sweetness and the word narc built into its name, Kuri, moved toward it. The hymn does not describe her deliberating. The narke of the Narcissus is in the name, a torpor, a heaviness, a drawing away of ordinary awareness from ordinary things. She reached for the flower. She reached for it in a meadow that had given her no reason to expect anything other than spring. What the hymn describes happening next is swift. The earth split. The ground opened along a seam that had been waiting for this moment, prepared in advance, the cooperation of Gaia already completed in the planting of the flower that brought Kori to this particular point. From the opening in the earth came Hades, called in the hymn by several names, among them the host of many, the ruler of those who have died, the son of Cronus, who governs the third great division of the world. He came in a chariot. The hymn describes it as golden. The horses were described as immortal and black, and they moved at the speed of what had been arranged rather than the speed of improvisation, because the arrangement had been in place long before the day arrived. Hades took Kore and descended back through the seam in the earth before any of the oceanid nymphs could intervene, though there is some uncertainty in the ancient sources about whether intervention would have been possible in any case, given the divine sanction already secured for what was happening. The hymn does not dwell on the descent itself. What it gives is the before and the after, the meadow's surface before the earth opened, and the meadow's surface after it closed. The chariot went down. The dark horses carried it through the cleft at whatever speed immortal horses carry a golden chariot through the arranged passages of the earth. The ground above them sealed, and the flowers that had been scattered across the surface of the meadow at the point where the seam had been were not displaced. The hymn does not describe them displaced. The narcissus was still there, or the other flowers were still there, or the surface of the place had the quality that sealed things have, the absence pressed into it, enormous, the surface itself unchanged, the spring continuing its business around the place where spring had stopped. This is a useful moment to think about the hymn as a document, what it is, what it has been through, how it arrived. A text composed somewhere in the 7th or 6th century BCE, probably copied many times in the centuries that followed, moving through whatever currents carry written documents across the ancient world, being included in some collections and excluded from others, surviving the loss of the great libraries and the collapse of the traditions that had produced it, becoming something that scholars in the later European tradition did not have direct access to, until a manuscript turned up in a collection in Moscow in 1777 and was published for the first time in that year. One manuscript, the single line of survival connecting the meadow in the opening of the hymn to the present moment, is extremely thin. The Narcissus might easily not have come down to us. The arrangement Zeus made with Hades might exist only in fragments of other texts, in vase paintings and terracotta figures, and the scholarly apparatus built around texts that quote a poem no one had seen. Instead, all 495 lines survived. The flowers are still named. The narcissus is still described as extraordinary in its fragrance. What the ancient world understood about Hades in relation to this event is worth attending to with some care. He was the legitimate king of the realm below, one of 3 sons of Cronus, who divided the world at the end of the war with the Titans, drawing lots for their domains. Zeus received the sky and the upper world. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the earth below the surface, the entire vast country of the dead. The division was complete and formal, and Hades' kingship over it was as legitimate as Zeus's kingship over Olympus. When the hymn frames his arrival in the meadow and his seizure of Kor as an act that had received prior divine sanction from Zeus, it is drawing on this understanding that what happened at Nyssa was not a violation of the divine order, but a restructuring of it. A daughter of the sky and the earth was being given to the Lord of what lies beneath the earth. A new division was being made. The world was being organized differently than it had been the day before. The ancient tradition held Hades as a bridegroom as much as a captor. The Homeric hymn frames him as the latter in Demeter's experience, the one who took her daughter without her knowledge or consent, while simultaneously framing him in the cosmic structure as the former. He had a legitimate claim. Zeus had granted it. The mechanisms of divine marriage in the ancient world did not require the consent of all parties, and the hymn does not attempt to disguise this or resolve the tension it creates. It holds both facts simultaneously, the legitimacy of the arrangement and Demeter's devastation at it, without pretending that one cancels the other. This is one of the things that makes the hymn feel old in the way genuinely old texts feel old. It does not smooth over what is uncomfortable. It proceeds, Zeus seated in the upper world, having given his consent in private. This is an image the hymn creates and then leaves standing without commentary. The rest of the Olympians continuing about their celestial business. The divine assembly occupying itself with whatever the divine assembly ordinarily occupied itself with, on a day that was, from their vantage, unremarkable. The arrangement had been made and was now being carried out. Somewhere below the bright air of Olympus, in a meadow of roses and crocuses and violets, the earth was opening. The chariot was rising from the dark beneath the surface. The narcissus was standing at the edge of its particular small radius of numbing sweetness, doing what it had been grown to do. And Zeus, if the hymn's account of his prior knowledge is taken seriously, knew all of this was happening and chose not to intervene. The hymn does not explain what Zeus understood the consequences to be. It does not give him a speech in which he accounts for the calculation he made when he agreed to Hades' request. What the text preserves is the fact of the agreement and its result without the interior reasoning that produced it. Ancient traditions are often this way. They record the decision without the deliberation, the act without the explanation that would make it feel familiar. The reader is left to sit with the gap. Zeus consented. The earth grew the narcissus. The meadow provided the place. Kori moved through the morning toward a flower whose fragrance carried stupor in its name, and the arrangement unfolded, the way arrangements do, when everything that needs to be in place has been put there by the appropriate divine hands in advance. The oceanid nymphs who had been gathering flowers alongside Corey in the opening of the hymn do not have speaking roles in the account of the abduction itself. They are present in the meadow before the event and absent from the account of the event, in the way that companions are often absent from the precise moments that change everything, not because they cease to exist, but because the event moved faster than presence allows. What the hymn gives as the single witness detail of the abduction moment is not the nymphs, but a cry. Kor called out. She called to her father Zeus. The hymn records this directly, without ambiguity. She called to Zeus for help, and Zeus, who had arranged what was happening, was not in a position to respond in the way the call asked. The distance between the call and the one it was directed toward was not only physical, not only the distance between a meadow at the edge of the earth and Olympus far above. It was the distance between what was being asked and what had already been decided. The earth closed above the chariot. This is the image the hymn moves through on its way to Demeter's first awareness that something has changed, the earth closing, the meadow's surface settling back into the undisturbed appearance of an ordinary afternoon, the seam that had opened, sealed. Whatever the flowers at that specific point in the meadow were doing, whether they were scattered by the eruption of the earth or simply stood as they had been standing, the surface of the meadow returned to the condition of a meadow. The absence inside it was enormous. The spring continued around it without adjusting. There is something worth attending to in the way the hymn is structured, the way it gives the meadow such care and such length at its opening, naming the flowers one by one, establishing the quality of the light and the movement of young women through an abundance of blossoms, and then allows the abduction itself to happen in a compressed passage that does not linger at its own center. The violence is not dwelt on. The seizure is described and moved through. The hymn is not interested in the abduction as spectacle. It is interested in what the abduction sets in motion, in Demeter's response, in the divine negotiation that follows, in the consequence for the world above the ground. The meadow is where the story begins. The moment of the chariot's emergence and descent is the pivot on which the whole vast structure turns, and then the meadow seals behind it, and the story goes elsewhere. What the Homeric hymn to Demeter preserves in its 495 lines is a picture of a world in which the divine arrangement of things and the human or semi-divine experience of those arrangements can be entirely different in character without either being false. The cosmos, as the hymn understands it, was organized by agreement among powers whose decisions had permanent consequences. Those consequences fell on people who had not been party to the agreement. The cosmos continued to function. The gods continued to do what gods do. And in a meadow at the plain of Nysa, the flowers continued to grow around a place where the ground had briefly opened to admit an arrangement that had been worked out somewhere above the clouds, in private, without witnesses who were not already complicit in the outcome. The narcissus standing alone in that meadow is the most precisely described element of the whole arrangement. The hymn gives it specific attention, describes it as extraordinary, as distinct from everything around it, as a flower with a fragrance that commands attention in a way ordinary flowers do not. Gaia grew it knowing what it was for. Hades knew where it was. Zeus knew that Gaia had grown it. Three divine powers knew the function of this specific flower in this specific meadow on this specific afternoon, and none of them moved to remove it before Kori arrived. The narcissus stood at its post in the meadow of Nysa in the same way that any object stands when everything that needs to happen has been arranged around it in advance, with a patience that is not really patience because it does not have to wait. It simply stands, and the thing that needs to arrive at it arrives. The golden chariot descended through the dark at a speed the hymn does not quantify. The immortal horses, black and silent, carried it through the passages of the earth, past whatever geography exists between the surface of the meadow and the realm below, through whatever transitions mark the difference between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The gold of the chariot caught no light on its way down, because there was no light for it to catch. The ground sealed above. The chariot arrived, eventually, at the place it was going. The meadow at Nyssa continued in its surface condition of ordinary spring. The oceanid nymphs, who had been present and then absent from the moment, were still somewhere in the vicinity of where they had been gathering flowers. The roses and crocuses and violets and irises and hyacinths were still where the morning had left them. The narcissus was still at the meadow's edge, its extraordinary fragrance still carrying narke in its name and in its chemistry, still drawing attention toward itself from the surrounding abundance of more ordinary blossoms. Nothing about the surface of the place recorded that the earth had opened. Nothing marked the location of the seam. The meadow looked exactly as a meadow looks when spring has been uninterrupted for a very long time, densely full, quietly moving in whatever low wind was passing, entirely indifferent to the arrangement that had just been carried out beneath it. The absence inside that surface was enormous, and the surface did not know it. This is what the oldest surviving account of the abduction of Persephone describes. Not a wound in the world's skin that could be seen and pointed to, but a closing, the meadow receiving itself back into ordinary appearance. The flowers at the point of rupture, standing or fallen, or simply continuing to exist in the way that flowers exist, when the thing that happened near them was not addressed to them. The spring persisting, the ground whole, and somewhere far below the whole, and ordinary surface of the plain of Nyssa, in a chariot that had already arrived at its destination, the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, Kor, who had been Kor, who was becoming something else, moving through the first passages of a realm that had been waiting for her with the patience of something arranged by divine agreement in the world above. The meadow settled. The flowers stood in their density of color. The spring held. And the enormous quiet where a voice had been calling out to a father who had known all along what he had agreed to, that quiet settled too into the surface of the afternoon, indistinguishable from the rest of what an ordinary spring afternoon in a flower-covered meadow sounds like when nothing has happened, which is to say, nearly silent, which is to say, still. The Styx moves first in any accounting of the waters below. Its name carries the oldest Greek word for hatred, stygos, and the river that holds that name runs in a great loop through the underworld, cold and dark, so ancient in its reputation that even the gods of Olympus swore their binding oaths by it, invoking its name to seal a promise that could not afterward be broken. To swear by the Styx was the most solemn act available to an immortal. It made the underworld's oldest river a form of cosmic law, a boundary not just between the living and the dead, but between what had been promised and what could never be undone. The second river is the Lethe. Its name means forgetfulness, and the tradition holds that the souls of the dead drank from it before their return to the world above, each one straightening from the surface of the water with their eyes newly empty of everything they had carried in, every name, every grief, every particular detail of the life that had just ended. The Lethe moved through the underworld at a pace that seemed almost not to move at all, its surface flat and gray, with no current visible and no far bank distinguishable from the near one, What it held was not water in any ordinary sense, but something that functioned like forgetting, something that the dead were given so that what came next could begin without the weight of what had come before. Then the Acheron, whose name carries the sense of woe, and whose crossing was the first practical business of the newly dead. Charon ferried the shades across it in a flat-bottomed boat that sat low in the water under the weight of gathered souls. The living buried their dead with a coin placed under the tongue or on the eyelids for this payment, a piece of bronze or silver pressed into the ferryman's palm on the far side of the crossing. Those who had not been properly buried, or who could not pay the fare, wandered the Acheron's near bank for 100 years before they were permitted to cross. The river itself was not punishing. It was simply the first passage, the first formal acknowledgement that the world above had been left behind. The Phlegethon burns, and has always burned. Plato, in the Phaedo, describes it as a river of fire that runs in a circle opposite to the Acheron, its current carrying heat and flame to regions of the underworld where fire serves as the instrument of a particular kind of consequence. Ancient accounts differ on where exactly the Phlegethon flows and what it touches. Some have it bordering Tartarus, the deepest and most remote region of the realm. Others describe it moving through the middle reaches without approaching any particular destination. What the tradition holds consistently is that the fire burns without consuming, the river flows without ceasing, and the light it gives is not the same as the light of the world above. It illuminates without warming, and the shadows it casts are the same color as the dark on all sides of it. Last of the five is the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, described by Homer as flowing out of the Styx and sharing something of its nature, a daughter river, in some sense carrying the Styx's cold reputation into a part of the underworld associated with the particular grief of the newly dead who have arrived before their time. Its name holds the sound of weeping. The ancient world was precise about this kind of detail, the distinction between the grief of one who had lived a full life and died in the proper order of things, and the grief of one who had been taken early, whose life had not yet arrived at its natural completion. The Cocytus belonged to the second kind. It ran among the shades of those who still remembered the world they had left too soon. 5 rivers, each one a different quality of the experience of being dead, the binding law, the release of memory, the practical crossing, the fire of consequence, the grief of early loss. Together they constituted the underworld's hydrological architecture, its water table and its moral geography, mapped onto each other so precisely that a soul's journey through the realm could be traced as much by the rivers it passed as by any other feature of the landscape. The underworld that these rivers ran through was not a formless dark. The ancient Greek tradition describes it as a place with the same confident particularity it brought to the description of any other major divine realm, a place with borders and regions and distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character and its own population, each presided over by the authority that governed the whole. Homer in the Odyssey calls it the House of Hades, using a word that implies not simply a building, but an estate, a domain, a place whose architecture reflected the status of those who lived in it. It had gates, it had great halls, it had the particular grandeur of a palace that had been there since the gods divided the world among themselves. Its foundations settled deep in the earth, its rooms full of the dead of every generation since the first human beings walked the surface of the world above. Pindar, writing in the early 5th century before the Common Era, adds a detail to the underworld's moral geography that the Homeric texts leave mostly in outline. In his account, the heroic dead, those who had lived with particular virtue across 3 successive lifetimes, were granted a place of honor in the realm below, their status recognized formally, their welcome extended by Persephone herself in her capacity as queen. The phrase Pindar uses is specific. She grants them honor in her halls. Not Hades granting it, not the authority of the realm in the abstract. The queen by name, extending recognition to those whose merit the tradition held, had earned it. The detail is small, but its implications are not. It places Persephone in an active role at the center of the underworld's social and moral order, not as a figure who inhabits the palace, but as the figure who decides who within it receives distinction. The palace itself stood at the center of the realm, its bronze doors the most frequently described architectural feature in surviving accounts. Ancient sources that describe the journey of the living into the underworld, whether it is Heracles on his 12th labor, Hermes moving as a divine messenger between the worlds, or Orpheus following the path of his lyre's sound down through the dark, tend to arrive eventually at those doors. They open onto halls where the assembled dead stand in orderly silence. The architecture is formal, deliberate, its claim to grandeur identical to the claim any palace above ground might make, with the single exception that the light in it has no visible source. It neither comes from windows, nor from torches, nor from the sky overhead, but is simply present, the flat, sourceless illumination of a place that exists entirely below the level where light originates. The three great regions of the underworld fall under Persephone's overarching sovereign jurisdiction, though their characters differ from each other so completely that they seem to describe not a single realm, but three different responses to the question of what death is. The asphodel meadows are the first and most populous. Homer describes them in the 11th book of the Odyssey as a vast flat expanse of pale flowers extending in every direction. Asphodel, a plant that grew abundantly on the rocky slopes of the Greek world and was associated in the ancient imagination with the life of the dead, planted on graves, offered at tomb sites. Its pale blooms, the appropriate decoration for the kingdom of those who no longer had access to the colors of the living world. The souls of the ordinary dead moved through the asphodel meadows slowly, their voices like the rustling of dry stems, their forms insubstantial enough that when Odysseus reached out toward the shade of his mother in that place, his hands passed through her. The meadows were not painful. They were not joyful. They were simply where the dead went when they were neither particularly distinguished nor particularly condemned, a place that endured because the dead endured, because the meadows were simply the form their endurance took. The Elysian fields held the dead of a different order, heroes who had been granted special favor by the gods, or who had lived with the kind of virtue that Pindar and other ancient sources describe as earning Persephone's formal recognition, arrived at the Elysian fields and found there something that the ancient tradition described with words that clustered around the ideas of brightness, ease, and perpetual mild weather. The Elysian fields were not paradise in the sense of a place whose pleasures were ecstatic. The ancient tradition is restrained on this point, as though the contrast with the asphodel meadows required something distinguishably better, but not so different in kind that it broke the continuity of what death was understood to be. The honored dead were still dead. They were simply more comfortable in it. Tartarus is the deepest region, and the one whose character is most distinct from the others. Hesiod, in the Theogony, gives Tartarus its own genealogy, a primordial force existing before the gods themselves, one of the first things to exist alongside Gaia and Chaos and Eros at the beginning of the world. The Tartarus that functions as a region of the underworld is derived from this primordial entity, but is not identical to it. The region is the abyss that lies so far below the surface of the earth that the Titans imprisoned there after the Olympians' victory, according to the tradition, would fall for 9 days before reaching the bottom. In the underworld's moral geography, Tartarus is the place where those whose offenses against the divine order had been most extreme, Tantalus, who served the gods the flesh of his own son, Sisyphus, who cheated death twice, Ixion, who raised his hand against Zeus himself, were sent to experience the consequences of what they had done, in forms designed to mirror and extend the nature of their offense. The stone that Sisyphus rolls forever up its slope never stays at the top. The water that Tantalus reaches for recedes from his lips. Ixion turns on his wheel without ceasing. The tradition does not describe these consequences as arbitrary suffering, but as the specific architecture of divine consequence, each punishment shaped precisely to the nature of the act that occasioned it. All of this, the meadows and the fields, the rivers, the palace, the deep abyss, the formal gradations of consequence and honor, fell under Persephone's jurisdiction, not Hades alone. The ancient sources are consistent on this point, even when they differ on everything else. The realm is named for Hades, but its queen is named too, and she is named not as a consort who shares in borrowed authority, but as a sovereign power whose domain is the underworld in its entirety. Petitioners who descended or sent messages below addressed themselves to both. Heroes who sought permission to perform some action in the realm required the consent of both. The administrative logic of the underworld, as the ancient Greek tradition understood it, was dual: 2 thrones, 2 presiding authorities, 2 divine figures whose agreement was required before the realm's arrangements could be altered. Hecate arrives in the Homeric hymn to Demeter at the moment of Cori's cry. She is the first divine figure to hear it, her position at the threshold of the worlds making her uniquely able to perceive a sound that originated at the boundary between the surface and the deep. Her function in the hymn is precise. She is a witness at the margin, a figure whose identity is entirely organized around her relationship to crossings, doorways, and the specific moment when one kind of place becomes another. Ancient sources describe her as holding a torch in each hand, or sometimes 2 torches and a key, the key belonging to the same symbolic vocabulary as the threshold. Hecate not just witnessing transitions, but in some sense presiding over their mechanism, holding the instrument that makes a door into a door rather than simply a wall. Torches are the more persistent image. Hecate with her torches appears in the hymn, in the vase paintings, in the literary descriptions of her cult practices, in the ancient texts that describe her appearing at crossroads at night with her retinue of dogs and the sound of keys. The torches burn in places where there is no wind to disturb them. They illuminate the specific narrow zone at the edge of the underworld where the path from the surface world arrives, and where the dead come in, a zone that is neither exactly above ground nor exactly below it, neither the world of the living nor the world of the dead, but the seam between them. Hecate's torches are what make that seam visible. She stands there with them burning in the ancient imagination whenever a crossing is made, when the newly dead arrive, when the rare living visitor descends, when a divine messenger passes through on some errand between the worlds. Her relationship to Persephone in the tradition is one of companionship and complementary function, where Persephone rules the realm in its fullness, its geography, its population, its hierarchy of honor and consequence. Hecate operates at its edges, its thresholds, its transitional zones. She is not subordinate to Persephone, but associated with her, the 2 figures appearing together in certain cult practices and in certain ancient sources, as a pair whose respective authorities are distinct but aligned. Persephone governs the interior, Hecate illuminates the approach. Between the two of them, the tradition describes the underworld as a fully administered realm, no crossing unmarked, no arrival unwitnessed, no soul unaccounted for in the vast quiet country below the surface of the world. The dead themselves are not undifferentiated in the ancient Greek understanding. They have a social order, a hierarchy of status, a distinction between those recently arrived and those long established in the realm. The shade of the Theban prophet Tiresias, whom Odysseus consults in the 11th book of the Odyssey, retains his prophetic faculties even after death. Homer attributes this specifically to Persephone's decision to preserve them, a detail that sits cleanly alongside Pindar's description of her granting honor to the heroic dead. She is, in the Odyssey's logic, the administrative authority who determines which faculties a particular shade retains. Tiresias is himself because she has decided he should remain himself, his mind intact in a realm where most shades have lost the sharpness of their individual character and drift through the asphodel meadows as something closer to impression than to person. That quality of drift is one of the underworld's most consistently described characteristics. The dead of the asphodel meadows are not tortured and not fully at peace. They exist in a condition that the ancient sources describe with a vocabulary of thinness, pallor, rustling, and dim continuation. They remember who they were. They move through the pale flowers in the shapes they wore in life. But the full weight of their personhood, the particular quality of attention and desire that made them themselves in the world above, has become attenuated, the way a sound attenuates as it travels outward from its source, losing definition without losing all trace of its original form. For most of the dead, this attenuation seems to be permanent. For those Persephone chooses to preserve, the prophets, the heroes, those whose merit the tradition recognizes as special, the thinning does not happen, or happens less completely, because someone in the realm's center has decided it should not. The palace halls where the dead stand in their orderly silence fill slowly across the centuries and do not empty. New arrivals enter through Sharon's crossing, pass through the asphodel meadows, and either remain in them or are directed elsewhere by whatever mechanism the tradition imagines as the underworld's processual logic. The three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, mortal men of particular wisdom and justice elevated to judicial function in the realm below, appear in various ancient sources as intermediaries in this process, though their role is not fully elaborated in the earliest texts. What the tradition emphasizes more consistently than their function is Persephone's overarching authority over their context. The court in which judgment occurs is her court. The realm to whose regions the judged souls are assigned is her realm. The economy of honor and consequence that makes the judgment meaningful is hers to administer. The Defixionis, the lead curse tablets found at archaeological sites across the ancient Greek and later Greco-Roman world, provide a different order of evidence for how ordinary people in the ancient world understood Persephone's power. They are small, no larger than a hand, their surfaces covered in closely written letters pressed into the soft metal with a stylus, then folded once or twice and deposited in a grave or a well or another place understood to be in communication with the underworld below. They are petitions. They address Persephone by name. They ask her to direct her agents of enforcement, the Erinyes, the ancient divinities of vengeance, against specific named individuals who have committed specific named wrongs. The wrongs named in surviving tablets include broken contracts, perjury, theft, and sexual betrayal. The petitioners are not priests or heroes or mythological figures. They are ordinary people who believed that in the queen of the underworld They had access to a real operative authority that could be petitioned and would, if the petition were correctly made, act. The Erinyes themselves, known in Latin as the Furies, and associated in Aclus's Oresteia with a chthonic authority that predates and in some ways rivals the authority of the Olympian gods, are connected in ancient sources to Persephone's domain. They pursue those who have committed crimes against the natural order, particularly crimes against blood relations, and their pursuit does not end at the boundary of the living world. They follow the guilty into death. They are the enforcement arm of a moral logic that the underworld's queen administers, the agents who ensure that what has been done in the world above is not simply forgotten when the one who did it crosses the Acheron. The Letha may erase the dead person's own memory of their life, but the Erinyes, in the tradition's logic, are not subject to forgetting. They remember. That is what they are for. Cerberus keeps the gate, three-headed in the most familiar ancient depictions, though some sources give him more. Hesiod's Theogony counts 50 heads, a detail that most later ancient sources quietly set aside in favor of the more visually manageable 3. His function is specific and does not resemble that of a simple guard. Cerberus prevents the dead from leaving, not the living from entering. A living person approaching the gate from outside finds that Cerberus admits them without difficulty. It is the shade who tries to leave that encounters the problem. The creature's attention is directed inward, toward the interior of the realm, toward the souls who might otherwise follow a living visitor back toward the surface world. He is the mechanism by which the underworld retains its population, and he belongs, like everything else in the realm, within the jurisdiction of its 2 thrones. The palace of Hades and Persephone is described in ancient sources with a consistency of architectural detail that suggests it occupied a stable and specific position in the Greek mythological imagination, rather than fluctuating with each poet's individual invention. Its bronze doors appear across multiple texts. Its great halls are spacious enough to hold the assembled dead without crowding. Its situation deep within the earth is described as a descent of considerable distance from the surface. Some ancient writers describe the underworld as lying below the roots of the mountains, others as existing beneath the sea's floor, others as occupying a region simply and unlocationably far below, in a direction that is down without being measurable in the way that distances above ground are measurable. The palace sits at the center of all of these descriptions, its architecture, the one stable point in a geography that sometimes varies between sources. Within those halls, 2 thrones. The tradition does not describe them in as much physical detail as it describes, say, the throne of Zeus on Olympus, but their formal equivalence is consistent across the ancient sources. Hades and Persephone as joint sovereigns, each with their own authority, each addressed directly in myths that require an approach to the realm's governing power. The composition of the Locrian Pinaces, the terracotta votive plaques from Locria Pasiphae in southern Italy, dated to the 5th century before the Common Era, shows Persephone seated in formal regal posture, a scepter across her lap, her expression composed and authoritative. The scepter is not decorative. In the visual vocabulary of ancient Greek divine imagery, it marks the specific kind of power that organizes a realm, that gives instructions and expects them to be carried out. The figure on the Locrian plaque is not waiting for someone else to exercise authority on her behalf. She is holding the instrument of her own. The torches appear in the Locrian imagery, alongside the scepter, Persephone holding both, or holding one of each, as though the 2 instruments together constitute the full description of what she is. The scepter for governance, the torch for illumination of the dark. Both functions are necessary in a realm that has no natural light, where to govern is also, in some sense, to be the source of whatever visibility exists. A ruler who carries a torch in the dark is making a different claim than a ruler who sits in sunlight, surrounded by its ambient brightness. She is not illuminated by the world she rules. She carries the light herself into the dark, and everything around her is visible because she has made it so. Hermes passes through this realm with a particular kind of ease that no other Olympian divine figure shares. As Psychopomp, the guide of souls, he moves between the world of the living and the world of the dead in both directions, escorting the newly dead downward and occasionally on specific divine errands, moving upward from the realm below back into the light. His relationship to the underworld is not that of a visitor. He passes through it repeatedly, its geography familiar to him, its inhabitants known. When he moves through the asphodel meadows on his way to the palace, the pale shades part around him without difficulty. When he crosses the rivers, the ferryman recognizes his caduceus, the staff wound with two serpents that marks him as a messenger whose passage between worlds has divine sanction. Hecate's torches illuminate the threshold when he arrives. The bronze doors open. The halls receive him. The underworld, in the fullest ancient Greek description of it, is not a place of chaos or formlessness or undifferentiated dark. It is an organized realm. It has a civil service, in effect, a ferryman, a three-headed gatekeeper, three judges, the two sovereigns at the center, and at the threshold Hecate, with her torches burning in the windless dark. Its rivers have names and functions. Its regions have distinct characters and distinct populations. Its rules are consistent. The dead remain, the living who enter must leave. The rare soul who is released from it carries conditions attached to their release that the realm's logic does not permit to be circumvented. What happens in the underworld stays organized. What is required by its moral architecture is required without exception, not because the architecture is cruel, but because it is the form that consequence takes in a cosmos that takes consequence seriously. Ancient petitioners who left their lead tablets in the earth understood this. They were not making wishes. They were filing petitions with an authority they believed was real, specific, and operative. A queen who sat at the center of the realm below the world and administered its affairs with the composed attention that her posture on the Locrian plaques conveys. Her expression on those ancient tablets is not warm and not cold. It is simply present, a figure who is attending to something and will attend to it with the full weight of a divine authority that the tradition, across multiple centuries and multiple literary and archaeological forms, consistently represented as genuinely her own. The underworld of the ancient Greek imagination is a very large, very ordered place. Its rivers move in the dark below the surface of the earth. Its halls fill slowly and never empty. Its queen sits at the center of it with her scepter and her torch, having arrived there by a path the tradition describes in careful detail, and having remained there by an arrangement that the same tradition holds was ultimately her own to inhabit, whatever the original circumstances of her arrival. The great bronze doors open when they need to open and close when they need to close. Cerberus watches the gate from inside. Charon crosses the Acheron with his latest passengers and returns for more. The asphodel meadows extend their pale flowers in every direction, and the shades of the ordinary dead move through them at their unhurried pace, and somewhere in the deep quiet of that country, Tiresias still has his mind intact, because the queen decided he should keep it. And at the threshold, where the path from the surface arrives and the path to the surface departs, Hecate stands with a torch in each hand. The flames burn steadily in a place where there is no wind to disturb them. They have been burning for a very long time, longer than any particular myth, longer than the specific events the tradition uses to explain how the realm came to have its current queen, longer than the oldest surviving text that tries to describe what lies below. The torches are simply there, illuminating the seam between one kind of world and another, marking the place where crossing happens, burning in their sourceless, patient way, while the realm behind them goes about its enormous, quiet, well-administered business somewhere far below, its rivers turning in the dark, its halls still, its queen at the center of all of it, and the pale flowers of the asphodel meadows moving slightly in an air that has no origin and no destination, as they have always moved, as they will continue to move, long after the last living voice has finished saying what it knows about this place. Sisyphus stood in the palace of Persephone, with his petition already arranged in his mind, the words ordered and ready, the argument polished by the long walk through the dark to get here. The palace around him had the quality of a place built to last, its halls wide and formal, its floors unmarked by weather, its walls rising into a darkness that did not press in but simply continued above the reach of the light. There were no windows. There was no need for windows. The palace did not orient itself toward any sky. It existed entirely within its own logic, and that logic was order, the administration of something so large and so old that the architecture had simply grown to match it, chamber by chamber, over an expanse of time that had no number. At the far end of the hall, Persephone was seated. The throne was not ornate in the way that thrones above ground tended toward ornament, not the accumulated display of a sovereign who needed to be believed. It did not need to insist on anything. The queen who occupied it had been occupying it long enough that the room had arranged itself around her as a natural feature of the space, the way a very old tree arranges the land around its roots, without effort or intention. She held a scepter across her lap. Her expression was the expression of someone who had heard many petitions and understood them all before they were fully spoken, not because she was impatient, but because the range of what the living wanted when they stood before her was not as various as they imagined. They wanted time. They wanted extension. They wanted the arrangement of their departure adjusted, moved slightly, made to accommodate the unfinished business they had left on the surface of the earth. And Sisyphus, standing at the beginning of the hall, with the length of polished stone floor between them, wanted this more precisely and more cleverly than most. The story, as the older sources preserve it, turns on an argument Sisyphus made with considerable care. His wife, he told Persephone, had failed to observe the proper funeral rites when he died. She had left his body unburied. She had made no offerings, performed no ceremony, conducted no correct passage between one state and the next. This was, Sisyphus argued, a dishonor, not primarily to him, but to the realm he was now standing in, Persephone's realm, the realm that required the dead to arrive through the correct doors, attended by the correct observances, properly prepared. An unburied man, arriving here through disorganized grief and insufficient ceremony, was an insult to the order of things. And Sisyphus, with the particular audacity of someone who has always believed the rules apply differently to him, proposed the obvious remedy. Let him return briefly to the surface, correct the situation, administer the proper rites himself, and come back. There is a version of this meeting in which Persephone pauses before answering. The pause is not uncertainty. It is the pause of a ruler who is already measuring the consequences of what she is about to grant, already knowing, at some level, that the permission she is about to extend is permission with a flaw built into it, that the logic Sisyphus is presenting is persuasive enough to deserve an answer, but not quite sound enough to trust entirely. The pause is the space between what the argument merits and what the request, if granted, will actually produce. And then she granted it. The tradition records this decision without apology. Sisyphus had made his case. The case had standing. The queen of the dead extended her authority, and Sisyphus walked back out of the palace, back through the bronze doors, back through the levels of the realm, back past the rivers and the meadows and the great gate, and into the light of the surface world, where he immediately declined to return. The detail the myth offers here is not cruelty, but comedy, and the comedy is in the specificity of Persephone's error. Not that she trusted him. The error was that the flaw in his petition was genuine enough to be a real flaw. The funeral rites genuinely had not been properly observed. The insult to the order of the dead genuinely required a remedy, and the same quality that made the argument sound, the same quality that made it worth granting, was the quality that Sisyphus was counting on her to respond to. He had told her exactly the truth, and the truth had contained, folded inside it, the mechanism of his escape. What the myth holds in this detail is something more interesting than a trick. It is the record of a sovereign who was not outwitted because she was foolish, but because she operated within the rules of her own realm, rules that Sisyphus had studied and found a corner in, a place where the rule and the exception met at an angle that could, with enough patience and the right argument, be opened. Hermes was eventually sent to retrieve him by force. The tradition records this outcome briskly, without sentiment. Zeus dispatched the messenger god to drag Sisyphus back to the underworld by whatever means were necessary, and Hermes, whose relationship to the realm of the dead was of a different kind than any living or dead person's, who moved between worlds, not as an exception to the rule, but as a function of a nature that was itself liminal, descended and collected what Persephone's ruling had been unable to hold. The stone is the punishment that followed. The hill in Tartarus is the permanent residence. The futility is the consequence, not of standing before Persephone and asking, but of walking away from the agreement she had extended in good faith, and taking the extension she had granted as simply a longer version of the door out. What the Sisyphus episode establishes, above everything else it also establishes, is the specific character of Persephone's authority. It is not authority that declines to be engaged. It is not remote, unreachable, sealed behind its own magnificence. Sisyphus stood in that hall and made a petition, and she heard it. The underworld, under her administration, was a realm in which a sufficiently constructed argument could find a hearing, in which the rules had structure precise enough that someone who understood them well could identify, at least sometimes, the pressure point. This is not a weakness in the sovereignty. It is the sovereignty, an absolute power that takes no petitions, is a different kind of power than the one these myths describe. What the tradition records is a queen who governs, who hears cases, who makes decisions that have consequences, and who must afterward live with the consequences of her decisions, as all sovereigns must. Orpheus arrived in the palace of Hades and Persephone, with his lyre in his hands, and his wife's absence still fresh enough to have a physical quality, the kind of fresh loss that sits somewhere between the ribs and moves when breathing. He had come down through all the same levels Sisyphus had navigated, past the same rivers, through the same mist, across the same flat pale meadows, and he had played as he walked, the music going ahead of him through the dark like a kind of light. The tradition records what happened to the underworld when Orpheus played. The Furies, those ancient divinities of vengeance who served the chthonic order and did not, as a general rule, weep, wept. Tantalus, standing in his pool, with the water receding from his lips and the fruit branches lifting away from his outstretched hands in the permanent performance of his punishment, forgot to reach for the water and the fruit because the music had replaced the reaching with something else. Sisyphus rested on his stone. The stone rested at the bottom of the hill. The entire organized business of the underworld stilled and listened, and when the music stopped, the silence after it was the kind of silence that retains the shape of what filled it. Persephone was in the hall when the music reached her. Ancient sources vary in exactly how they describe this moment. Ovid's Metamorphoses and Virgil's Georgics each approach it from a slightly different angle, each preserving something the other doesn't quite catch, but the versions agree on the essential image. Persephone was moved. The word the tradition reaches for is not simple emotion. It is something more formal, more structural. The Queen of the Dead was affected in some way that mattered to the administration of what she presided over, by what Orpheus had brought with him and put into sound. She sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had already made the decision that she would presently announce. The music had done its work, not by overcoming her judgment, but by informing it, by making present, in the halls of a realm that existed specifically to receive everything the living world would eventually produce, the full weight of what Eurydice's absence was. Persephone gave her consent alongside Hades. The tradition is consistent on this point, that both sovereigns of the realm agreed to the conditional release, not just Hades, not a decision made by one half of the court and tolerated by the other. Persephone's consent was required, and Persephone's consent was given, and the condition she and Hades together attached to Eurydice's release, that Orpheus not look back at her during the ascent, that he trust the agreement and walk forward into the light without turning, was a condition that reflected the specific logic of a realm that operated by rules. The rule was, the dead do not follow the living back unless the passage is correctly observed. The passage required forward movement, sustained trust, the walk completed without interruption. Orpheus knew this. He turned anyway, whether from love or doubt, or the unbearable nearness of the presence behind him, and the terror of having come so far through so much dark, to end with a step that didn't quite hold. The tradition doesn't adjudicate which of these it was, only that he turned, and that in turning he undid what Persephone's consent had made possible. What the myth holds in that turning is a portrait of a sovereign whose decisions are irreversible once the conditions they were granted on are broken. The grace was real, the condition was real. When the condition failed, the grace withdrew, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of a compact that had been conducted with exact terms and had been broken at the moment of completion. Persephone does not appear again in the accounts of Orpheus's ascent. She does not have to. The decision had already been made at the moment he stepped across the boundary of her realm. What happened after was Orpheus's, and the story he carried back to the surface was still in some sense a story about the queen who had said yes before he turned. The lead tablets found in the earth across the ancient Greek world, pressed small and folded and buried in graves and wells and sacred deposits, address Persephone directly. These are the Defixiones, cursed tablets, and they survive in considerable numbers. Their surfaces, covered in closely written characters, pressed into the metal with a stylus, each one a petition from a person who had been wronged and wanted the matter addressed by someone with the authority to address it. The tablets invoke Persephone by name. They name the petitioner's enemy. They describe the wrong that was committed, a debt unpaid, a testimony given falsely, a theft, a harm of various kinds and weights, and they ask Persephone to direct her agents against the named individual with the force that the named wrong merits. The Erinyes, but those ancient divinities who in the mythological tradition served as instruments of retribution against the violation of sacred bonds. Aeschylus's Eurystheia holds them as the oldest of all divine presences, older than the Olympians, rooted in the earth and in the claims of blood and kinship, were understood in this practice as Persephone's to direct, as agents operating within her jurisdiction, as something she could be petitioned to deploy. The defixio, as an object, has a very specific quality, no larger than a hand when unfolded, the surface of the lead worn to a thin flexibility, the writing dense and exact. These were not things made quickly or carelessly. The person who made one had thought about what they wanted to say. They had committed it to metal, which does not decay. They had folded it in the particular way that sealed the petition and directed it downward, toward the realm from which it was not meant to return. They buried it or dropped it into water or placed it in a grave so that it would travel the correct direction, the direction of the realm over which Persephone held authority. The deposit was not public. It was not a prayer offered in a temple in front of witnesses. It was a direct transmission, private and permanent, from one person who had been wronged to a sovereign who could act on the information. The person who pressed those words into the lead believed, with whatever complexity or doubt ancient belief contained, that the queen who received the tablet had the power and the will to do something about it. What the tablets record, taken together as a practice rather than as individual objects, is the texture of Persephone's authority in the lives of people who were not heroes or gods or figures in a literary tradition. Orpheus was a poet of impossible skill. Sisyphus was a king of legendary cunning. But the person who pressed a wrong into a lead tablet was someone who had been deceived in a business dealing, or lied about in a lawsuit, or injured in a way that the institutions of the living world had not corrected. They came to Persephone because they believed she had the agents and the will to apply a correction that was otherwise unavailable. This is not an honorary queenship. It is the sovereignty of the court of last resort, the authority that receives what everything else has failed to handle, and that operates by rules older and more fundamental than the rules of any world above it. The 12th labor of Heracles brought the greatest of the Greek heroes into Persephone's hall under different conditions than any previous petitioner. Heracles came alive, which was unusual. He came by the instruction of another authority, dispatched by Eurystheus as the culminating task of the labor sequence. He came with a purpose that was not a petition in the usual sense, not a request for a soul to be released, not a personal grievance seeking redress, but a commission to take Cerberus, the guardian of the gate, from the underworld and bring him briefly to the surface. And he came, according to the ancient sources, including Apollodorus's library, knowing that he would need to obtain permission from the rulers of the realm before he could take anything from it. Persephone and Hades heard the request. The condition they set, Apollodorus records, was specific and non-negotiable. Heracles could take Cerberus to the surface on one condition only, that he subdue the creature without weapons, using nothing but his bare hands and whatever physical strength his nature allowed him to bring to bear. No club, no weapons of any kind. The logic of the condition reflects the logic of the realm and its ruler. The underworld was a place governed by rules, and the rule here was that what Heracles wanted to remove from it could only be taken through an act that belonged to his own nature, through the application of precisely what made him Heracles, rather than anyone else, with no borrowed instruments and no shortcuts. The condition was a test not of his capacity, which Persephone and Hades clearly knew, but of his willingness to meet the realm on its own terms, rather than the terms he normally operated on. Cerberus at the gate was a different order of presence than anything above ground. The tradition describes him in various ways across various sources. 3 heads in the most familiar accounts, a serpent's tail, snakes rising from his back, each head with a different expression, the middle one steady, the 2 outer heads alert to different directions, the whole creature oriented simultaneously toward everything that might arrive and everything that might attempt to leave. He was not a monster in the sense of being formless or chaotic. He had a function, and he performed it with absolute consistency. Nothing that entered the underworld would leave it again through the gate he guarded. The rule was not his rule. He did not make it. He simply was the enforcement of it, placed at the boundary where the rule required enforcing, and he had been there for as long as the gate had existed. Heracles approached him without weapons, which was unusual enough that Cerberus's 3 heads must have registered something different in the approach, not the familiar passage of the dead going inward, not the flight of the terrified attempting to go outward, but someone walking toward him, as though what was about to happen was a task to be completed rather than a confrontation to be resolved by force. What the labor required in the end was something closer to patience than to violence. Heracles subdued Cerberus with his bare hands and his body, with the wrestled grip of someone who was willing to stay in the hold until the outcome declared itself. And Cerberus, who had no instruction covering this situation, whose entire existence was oriented toward a function that Heracles was not violating in the usual sense, since he had Persephone's permission and was not trying to escape but to escort, yielded to the completion of the labor. Heracles led him to the surface. Eurystheus, who had been bold enough to assign the labor from a safe distance, was reportedly not at all composed when the actual creature arrived in front of him, and then Heracles returned Cerberus to the underworld, restored the guardian to the gate where he had always stood, and the realm resumed its normal operations. Persephone's permission had framed the whole episode, had made possible what would otherwise have been an act of theft, and the conditions she had attached to that permission had shaped how the labor was performed. The outcome was Heracles' accomplishment. The framework within which it was possible was hers. The Odyssey, Homer's account of the returning hero's long passage home after the Trojan War, sends Odysseus to the edge of the underworld at the direction of the witch Circe, who instructs him to dig a pit, pour libations, and sacrifice animals so that the blood would draw the shades of the dead up to him from below. What Odysseus needed from this consultation was specific and practical information. He needed to speak with the seer Tiresias, who in death as in life retained the gift of prophetic knowledge, and who alone among the dead could tell Odysseus what his path home required. The ritual worked as Circe had described. The dead came up toward the blood, pressing toward it from the darkness with the same hunger and urgency that all the underworld's inhabitants brought to anything that reminded them of the warmth and substance of the world above. And Odysseus stood at the edge of the pit he had dug and held them back with his drawn sword while he waited for Tiresias to arrive. Homer refers to Persephone across this episode with the repeated phrase Potnia Persephone. The word Potnia, mistress, lady, queen, in a register that carries both honorific respect and the acknowledgement of real functional authority, appears alongside her name more than once in the episode, and the repetition has the quality of a reminder. Not that the listener has forgotten who governs this realm, but that the administrative structure of the place Odysseus is conducting his consultation at the edge of Scorv is fully operative, fully present, fully organized around a sovereignty that does not need to appear in person to be felt. The shades that come up to the blood are there because Persephone oversees where they go and what they do. The consultation Odysseus is conducting is, in the formal sense, happening in her jurisdiction. He is permitted to be there. Circe's instruction gave him the ritual access, but the realm he is accessing is organized by rules that run deeper than any individual ritual, and those rules belong to Persephone. The episode closes with a moment that Homer records without drama, but with full attention, having spoken with Tiresias and with several other shades who pressed toward the blood, his own mother among them, Achilles, Agamemnon, the great figures of the generation before him, each one carrying what they carried into death and still holding it. Odysseus began to sense the quality of the realm closing around the consultation. The number of the dead increased. The pressing toward the pit increased. And somewhere back in the darkness of the realm, not visible, not approaching, not named as present in that immediate location, the authority that had organized everything around him was still there. Homer describes Odysseus's fear that Persephone might send a gorgon-headed monster from the depths of the realm against him. The fear is Homer's way of marking the boundary of what Odysseus's permission extended to. He had ritual access. He had conducted the consultation, and now the consultation was complete, and the clever hero, who had navigated so much by intelligence and nerve, knew that the permission had a limit, and that the sovereign who could enforce that limit was not elsewhere. She was present in the sense that any governing authority is present in the space it governs, even when it is not visible. Odysseus turned and went back to his ship. He moved quickly, the tradition records, which is an unusual condition for the most calculating of all Greek heroes. He did not pause to confirm the passage was clear. He did not linger at the boundary to observe it from the side of the living one more time. He moved away from the pit, away from the growing noise of the dead pressing toward it, away from the dark that extended behind the noise and the shades and the blood, and back toward the ship that represented the technology of return, the mechanism of getting to wherever he was going next. Homer follows him back. The narrative goes with Odysseus. The underworld does not follow, and does not need to follow. It simply continues as it always continues, its rivers moving through the levels, its halls populated with the accumulated dead of every generation, its boundaries held by the guardian at the gate, its rivers flowing by their separate natures, through the dark, governed, ordered, organized around the authority of the queen, enthroned at its center. What the tradition preserves across all these episodes and all these sources and all the centuries during which they were copied and recited and painted on pottery and pressed into lead and carved into stone is a consistent portrait of a sovereignty that is not defined by its origins. The myth of Persephone's arrival in the underworld is a myth about how she came to be where she is, but the episodes that record what she does in the realm, what she grants, what she withholds, what conditions she attaches to her decisions, what petitions she hears, and how she answers them, what her authority extends to, and what the texture of that authority feels like to the people who have to reckon with it. These are the record of something that had already become fully what it was. Sisyphus, standing in her hall with his argument prepared, was not standing before someone who needed to assert her legitimacy. He was standing before someone who had been enthroned long enough that the distinction between the ruler and the realm had become difficult to locate. The Locrian pinacates from the ancient sites of southern Italy, those small terracotta plaques depicting a seated female figure with a scepter across her lap, were pressed from clay and fired and offered by worshippers who were coming to Persephone for something, for intervention, for protection, for the exercise of an authority they believed was both real and responsive. They were not addressing a literary figure, they were addressing the sovereign of the dead as a present power in the same sense that the dead were a present power, not somewhere else, not abstract, but in the world as the world actually was, beneath and alongside and continuous with everything visible. The bronze gates of the palace stand at the far end of the hall where Sisyphus made his petition, where Orpheus's music moved through the dark and affected even the Furies in their ancient and unmerciful work. They open when the queen decides they will open, and they remain closed when the queen decides they will remain closed, and the logic of those decisions belongs to a governing intelligence that has been in place long enough to understand everything the living imagine they know about what is being asked. The realm continues its particular operations, the rivers in their channels, the meadows in their permanent pale, the great organized silence of the halls where the accumulated dead of all the generations stand in their patient order. Outside the palace, somewhere at the boundary between the levels of the underworld and the surface world where the light is, Hermes passes in his characteristic traveling motion, moving between the worlds on whatever current errand requires him to be, in two places across a very short time, the caduceus in his hand, marking him as neither entirely here nor entirely there. And behind all of it, at the center of the realm, the queen is still seated. Odysseus was already at his ship when the noise of the dead behind him finally faded into the distance of the dark. His hands were on the prow. The crew was already at the oars. He had what he had come for, the information, the prophecy, the navigation forward, and he was moving the way living things move when they have successfully visited the country of the dead and completed what they came to do, with the particular relief of someone who has been reminded very specifically of exactly what they are and how much of the world they are not the sovereign of. The water opened in front of the ship. The far shore of the underworld receded. The boundary held. And behind the boundary, organized and ordered, and in full operation, the realm went on about its business without him, its queen at its center, her authority persisting in the dark the way the dark persists, which is to say, without effort and without interruption, simply continuing as it had been continuing long before the last living visitor arrived, and as it would continue long after the last record of his visit had worn smooth, and the name of the man who dug the pit and held the sword had passed through enough generations to become itself the kind of story that only comes back to us in fragments of old papyrus and the careful handwriting of scholars who knew they were holding something they did not fully understand. The pomegranate, when it is whole, gives very little away. Its skin is a dull leathery red, not bright, not luminous, but the particular muted red of something that has dried slightly in the sun, the color of old clay or darkened wine. It is roughly spherical and heavier than it looks, the way a stone is heavier than it looks, because it is more densely packed inside than the eye expects. The crown at its top, where the flower once was, opens into a stiff, dry calyx, like the points of a small star. Nothing about the outside of the fruit suggests what is inside. Nothing about it offers itself. When it is split open, everything changes. The interior is a dense architecture, a white membrane, almost translucent, dividing the fruit into chambers, and within those chambers, the seeds. Each seed is encased in its own skin, red and tight and full, the color of garnets, the color of a deep winter sunset, the color of something that has been holding pressure for a long time and is only barely containing it. The juice inside each one is darker than the skin, nearly black at the center, bleeding outward into crimson at the edge. A pomegranate held in the hand is a small, sealed world. A pomegranate opened is an interior, structured, compartmented, improbably rich. It is not the kind of fruit that gives itself up all at once. It requires patience. It requires that something be divided before it yields anything at all. The tradition holds that in the deep interior of the underworld, in the palace of Hades, at the center of the kingdom of the dead, it was this fruit that Hades brought to Persephone in the last moments before her departure. The Homeric hymn to Demeter describes it simply. Hermes had already descended. He had come at the instruction of Zeus, the arrangement made, the terms settled, the return of the maiden from the underworld agreed upon in the way that things between the Olympian gods were agreed upon, which is to say, with weight behind it, and not easily undone. Hermes was already somewhere on the road downward, moving through the levels of the underworld at his characteristic pace, neither hurrying nor slow. And in the moment before his arrival, the hymn says, Hades gave Persephone the seeds to eat, knowing what they would mean. The logic of the act lives in the deeper structure of how the Greek world understood the relationship between the living and the dead. The dead belonged to their realm because they had consumed its substance. To eat in the underworld was to take its material into the body, to accept a thread of that world into the self, not metaphorically, but in the particular way that ancient Greek religious thought understood eating as a form of participation, of membership. The dead ate of the underworld, and therefore remained. A living person who ate of it acquired the same bond. The bond was not symbolic. It was as real and as insoluble as any other substance the body had taken in and made part of itself. The eating of the seeds, in the tradition's own terms, was not a trick and not a punishment. It was a binding, a thread run through the self that would always know its way home to the dark. How many seeds Persephone ate is a question that ancient sources answer differently, and the different answers have persisted across the tradition for so long that no single number has ever fully displaced the others. The Homeric hymn itself, the oldest and most complete account of these events, specifies a single seed, one seed eaten in the moments before Hermes arrived. One small, garnet red chamber of fruit, and the bond was made. In Ovid's telling, written in Latin 6 or 7 centuries after the hymn, and shaped by the Roman imagination rather than the Greek one, the number is 6. 6 seeds, a 6-month division of the year, a winter of 6 months, and a summer of 6 months. The mathematics are clean, the symmetry satisfying in the way that Roman literature tended to prefer its symmetries. Other versions preserved in fragments and commentaries across the ancient world give 3 seeds, or 7, and scholars have read these variations not as errors of transmission, but as evidence of something more interesting than error, the myth moving through different landscapes, adjusting itself to local conditions, answering a local question about winter's length with a local arithmetic. A community in which winter lasted 4 months would have found the logic of a single seed, or 3, reasonable and true. A community in which winter lasted 6 months would have found Ovid's accounting more nearly right. The myth, understood in this way, was not a fixed story with a single correct answer at its center, but a structure capacious enough to hold multiple answers simultaneously, each of them locally valid, each of them generated by the same essential question. Why does the ground close over itself every year and refuse to yield, and why does it open again? The pomegranate's arithmetic was the tradition's way of saying as many seeds as your winter lasts, as many months of cold as the fruit required to make the bond hold. Hermes, the divine messenger, the psychopomp, the god uniquely capable of moving between the world of the living and the world of the dead without becoming fixed in either, descended through the underworld on his errand with the ease of someone for whom a door has never been locked. He carried the caduceus, the herald's staff entwined with serpents, which was his marker of passage through both realms. He moved through the asphodel meadows where the ordinary dead drifted among pale flowers in their perpetual, undisturbed suspension. He passed the rivers, the gray stillness of the Lethe, the Styx with its particular weight, the Acheron with its slow ferry crossing, the fires of the Phlegethon burning without heat in the airless dark. He passed through the bronze gates of the palace and the great halls, and arrived where Hades and Persephone sat in the formal arrangement of their sovereignty, the king and queen of the dead, enthroned at the center of the realm. The hymn gives Hermes's message without elaboration. Zeus has commanded that Persephone be returned. The upper world requires it. Demeter, her mother, has made that requirement impossible to ignore. What Demeter had done in the months of Persephone's absence is part of the myth in its fullest form, and it is worth dwelling on, not as context for the departure, but as the force that made it possible. Demeter, goddess of the grain and harvest, had withdrawn, not in grief only, though the grief was real, and the hymn describes it with the specificity of someone who had watched it happen, the goddess moving through the world in disguise, asking after her daughter, finding no one who would tell her where the child had gone. The grief was genuine and enormous, but the withdrawal was also active, also willful. Demeter had decided that as long as her daughter was in the underworld, the earth would not yield. The grain that was already planted refused to emerge. The seeds buried in the soil lay still in the dark, inert, with nothing to coax them up into the light. Across the whole of the earth, the tradition holds, the ground closed itself and remained closed, and the harvests failed. What the myth describes through the frame of Demeter's grief is winter given a cause, not a mechanism, not a cosmic schedule, not a property of the world's construction. Winter as an emotion, as a decision, as the consequence of a mother's rage and sorrow directed at the order of things that had taken her daughter without asking her consent. The cold was personal. The bare fields were personal. The stubborn refusal of the grain to move was personal, and it was directed at Zeus as much as at Hades, because the hymn is clear that Zeus had known. He had agreed to the arrangement in advance. He had given his consent to Hades and said nothing to Demeter. The withdrawal of fertility from the earth was Demeter's answer to that silence, and it was an answer that could not be ignored for long, because it threatened the one thing that kept the Olympians in their position, the sacrifices and offerings of human beings, which required crops to grow and surplus to exist. It was necessity, then, as much as compassion, that moved Zeus to send Hermes downward. The famine had gone on long enough that it could not continue without ending something that the divine order of things required to persist. Zeus sent the messenger, and the message went down through all the levels of the earth to where Hades sat, in his palace with Persephone beside him, and the terms were delivered. She would return to the upper world, and in the moment before she rose, Hades gave her the seeds. The hymn describes the giving of the seeds with a particular quality of attention, not as a cruel final act of a captor, but as something more complex than that. Hades knew what the seeds would mean. He knew that a bond made through eating could not be dissolved by any later agreement between the gods of the upper world, that it would persist through every negotiation and every renegotiation that it was the kind of thing that outlasted divine politics. He gave her the seeds, and she ate them, and Hermes witnessed this, and then she rose. What the tradition makes of Hades' action in that moment is not entirely settled. Some readings hold it as manipulation, a final assertion of claim over someone who had been taken without consent. Others, drawing on the evidence of the Locrian pennycakes and the votive tablets and the cult worship at Enna and across the Greek world, read it differently as the making permanent of something that had already, in the course of the months she had spent there, become real. Persephone had been queen in that palace. She had sat beside Hades on the throne. The petitions of the dead had come before her. The Erinyes had moved at her direction. The heroes who descended living into the underworld had addressed their appeals to her alongside her husband, because they understood, correctly, that her authority in that realm was not honorary. The seeds may have made binding what was already, in some sense, that the tradition struggled to express in other terms, already true. Hermes led her upward through the dark passage, through the levels of the underworld in reverse, through the bronze halls and the rivers and the asphodel meadows and the long corridor of the earth's interior, and the world they were moving toward was the world that had been waiting without growing since she left it. The ground up above was flat and cold and bare under a sky that had not changed its temperature in all the months of Demeter's grief. The grain was in the soil, as it always is. The seed does not disappear when winter comes. It simply refuses, or is refused, or is held in a suspension that looks from the outside like dying, but is something else entirely. The seed in the frozen ground is not dead. It is waiting. It is waiting for the signal that the tradition says can only come from one source, and that source had been below the earth, ascending now with Hermes ahead of her through the dark, toward the place where her mother was already somewhere on the surface, moving fast across the bare ground in the direction of the passage's opening. The moment the hymn describes, when Demeter and Persephone are reunited, is one of the few moments in the text that moves at the speed of emotion rather than the speed of narration. They run toward each other. The image is simple, and the emotion behind it is enormous, and the hymn does not linger on it. It describes the reunion, and then, almost in the same breath, it describes the earth responding. Because Demeter's grief had been the mechanism of winter, and Demeter's joy, or the release of grief, or the decision to stop withholding, or some combination of all of these, was the mechanism of spring. The grain that had been lying still in the cold soil began to move, not all at once in any single place, but across the whole of the earth simultaneously, in every field where the seed had been buried and had waded through the cold. The shoots began to push upward through the dark soil toward the surface of the ground. Each shoot is a small thing. This is worth holding for a moment, the physical reality of what the myth is describing beneath the divine machinery of its explanation. A grain shoot emerging from the soil is a thread of pale color, barely distinguishable at first from the brown of the earth around it. Bending slightly under the resistance of the soil, it is pushing through, fragile and precise and unhurried in its progress upward. It does not emerge quickly. It takes days to become visible at the surface of the ground, and when it first appears, it is not the vivid green it will become later, but something closer to white or pale yellow, the color of something that has not yet encountered light. The light changes it. In the presence of light, it begins to green, and the field that was bare becomes over the course of several days faintly colored, a wash of pale green over dark soil, barely perceptible from a distance, the kind of change that requires knowing the field in its winter state to recognize the shift. This is what the myth explains. Not why spring comes. The tradition does not argue that Demeter's withdrawal is the physical mechanism by which temperatures change or days lengthen. It is not a science, but a story. But why the particular quality of spring feels the way it feels, the relief in it, the sense that something that had been held very tightly has been released. The grain emerging from the ground after winter carries in this tradition the particular emotional register of a return, not simply a seasonal transition, because that is what it is. Not the world resuming a process that was never interrupted, but the world being given back something that had been taken from it, or had taken itself below, or had been bound and released and sent upward again through the dark passage with a divine messenger walking ahead. Persephone's emergence from the underworld is spring. Her descent, each year when the time comes, is winter. This is the framework the tradition constructed to hold these two facts inside the same story. The Queen of the Dead and the Daughter of the Harvest are the same figure, and her movement between the two realms is the movement between the two seasons, and this is not coincidence or metaphor, but the tradition's genuine account of why the world works the way it works. The account is not uniform across all ancient sources. Different communities told it with different emphases, different proportions of time above and below, different framings of Persephone's disposition toward her divided life, but the central structure persists across all of them. What is more interesting than the structure is what the structure implies about Persephone herself. The myth, followed to its conclusion, does not describe a figure who was taken from a bright world and permanently diminished by what happened to her. It describes a figure who now moves freely between two worlds that are differently ordered, but neither of which is foreign to her. A figure who knows the meadow above and the palace below with equal familiarity, who carries authority in both directions. The scholarship around the Persephone figure, from Walter Burkert's work on Greek cult practice to Carl Karania's analysis of the Eleusinian mysteries, has consistently noted that the cult worship of Persephone in the ancient world does not frame her periodic return to the underworld as a tragedy. The votaries who brought their offerings to her sanctuaries at Enna and at Elysus and at Locrea Pisophyri were not mourning her, they were acknowledging her. They were recognizing a goddess who moved between worlds and who, by virtue of that movement, had a kind of knowledge that neither the purely chthonic nor the purely Olympian gods possessed, the knowledge of both sides of the boundary, the knowledge of what the earth contains and what it produces, the knowledge of what is buried and what grows. In the months when Persephone is below, the tradition holds, the world above is in her absence. The grain is in the ground, waiting. The trees have drawn their energy inward. The cold holds the surface of things in a particular stillness that is not death, not quite, but is something suspended, held, awaiting the turn. The tradition does not frame this as punishment or loss, any more than it frames sleep as punishment or loss, or the darkness before dawn as something to be remedied. It is a phase in a cycle that has its own internal logic and its own duration, and its ending is as guaranteed as its beginning. Demeter's grief in this reading is a structurally necessary part of the story, even if it is not the whole story. It is the tradition's way of insisting that the absence is real and costs something, that winter is not a neutral interval, but a withdrawal, a holding back, a refusal that carries weight. The suffering of the famine, the bare fields, the grain lying inert, and the sacrifices ceasing, and Zeus himself moved to intervene. All of this insists that what happens when Persephone descends matters, that it registers as loss on the surface of the world, even as it is, from the perspective of the underworld, simply the queen returning to her throne. Both of these things are true simultaneously in the tradition. The loss is real, the return is also real. The cycle holds both without resolving the tension between them into something simpler than it is. The pomegranate seeds are the hinge on which this cycle turns. One seed, or 6 seeds, or 3, or 7, however many the community telling the story in a particular landscape had reason to count. The arithmetic of the bond determines the arithmetic of the seasons. Each seed is a month of winter, or a portion of winter, depending on which account one follows. Each seed is also, in the logic of the tradition, a chamber of the fruit that Hades offered and Persephone ate, in the palace at the center of the earth, with the divine messenger already descending through the levels of the underworld on his way to escort her out. The pomegranate is the fruit of both worlds. It grows above ground in sunlight, ripens in the heat of late summer or early autumn, and its interior, when split open, is the color of the deep earth, the color of garnets and old blood, and the interior of things that have been long buried. It is perhaps for this reason that the tradition settled on it as the fruit through which the binding was made, not as an arbitrary choice, but as a recognition that this particular fruit already carried the quality of both realms in its own structure. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the ancient initiation rites conducted at Eleusis near Athens, which were among the most significant and widespread religious practices in the ancient Greek world for close to 1,000 years, held Persephone's story at their center. The mysteries were initiations. They moved the participants through an experience that ancient sources, including Pindar and later Cicero, writing from a Roman perspective, describe as having permanently altered the initiate's relationship to the question of what comes after death. The content of the mysteries was never written down, or if it was, nothing has survived, because the initiates were bound to silence. What can be reconstructed from the indirect evidence of ancient sources, from the archaeological record at Eleusis, and from occasional allusions in ancient literature, is that the myth of Persephone and Demeter was enacted in some form, that descent and return were central to whatever the initiates experienced, and that the experience of that descent and return was understood to be transformative in the specific way that only a real encounter with something vast can be transformative. The tradition, through the mysteries, was not content to tell the story of Persephone as an explanation of the seasons. It used that story as the structure of an experience, as a shape into which human beings could enter and emerge changed. Initiates who passed through the mysteries at Eleusis were, the tradition held, in a different relationship to death afterward, not because they had been promised something specific about what came after, but because they had moved in some form through the same structure that Persephone moved through, down and up, into the dark, and out of it again, carrying something back that could not be articulated but persisted. The hymn to Demeter was probably composed in connection with these rites. Scholars, including Walter Burkert, have argued that it functions as a kind of mythological foundation document for the Eleusinian ritual, providing the divine narrative that the human ceremony enacted. The hymn ends not only with Persephone's return, but with the establishment of the mysteries themselves. Demeter, still in her grief and anger, takes up residence at Eleusis and instructs the local people in the rites that will be performed in her honor, establishing the ceremonies that will persist for centuries. The myth and the ritual are folded into each other in the tradition's own account of their origin. The story explains why the rites exist, and the rites give the story its function beyond narrative. What the pomegranate makes possible in this larger frame is not simply the explanation of seasons, but the establishment of a permanent relationship between the two worlds. Without the seeds, the story might have ended in simple resolution. Persephone returns, Demeter's grief ends, the grain grows, nothing changes. The seeds prevent this. The seeds ensure that the story cannot end in resolution, because the bond they create is the kind that cycles rather than concludes. There is no final departure from the underworld and no final surrender of the upper world. There is only the movement between them, year after year, the descent and the return, the queen going down to her palace and coming back up to the meadow, carrying in herself the knowledge of both. This, the tradition suggests in its deepest register, is not a tragedy, it is a pattern, and patterns do not end, they simply continue, recurring in the way that all the recurring things recur. The grain, the cold, the long months of suspension, and then the slow, unhurried push of the first shoots through the dark soil, upward toward a light they have not yet reached, pale and fragile and absolutely certain of what they are doing. In the time after Hermes escorted Persephone back to the surface, the tradition holds that the earth moved all at once. Not dramatically, the tradition does not stage it as a sudden eruption of green, but in the way that the earth actually moves when it warms, gradually, in small increments, in individual shoots barely distinguishable from the soil around them, across the whole of the available ground, simultaneously. In a field where the seed had been buried and had waded through the cold, the thread of pale color began its slow upward progress. One field, and then another, and then the whole of the cultivated world at once. Every buried seed receiving the same signal, every one of them beginning the same motion on the same morning. Demeter moved across the earth, restoring what she had withdrawn, and the restoration was specific and physical, not the broad symbolic gesture of a grieving god returning to her work, but the actual reinstatement of the conditions that made germination possible, the soil warming, the moisture returning to the correct depth, the temperature at the seed level reaching the precise threshold at which the dormant matter inside the seed begins its particular business of becoming. The tradition describes this as a god's act. The experience of it, for the people living through the first spring after the long cold, would have been indistinguishable from any other spring except in its intensity, the relief, the almost physical quality of the earth yielding again after the long refusal. The story persists in the form the hymn gave it, supplemented by Ovid's retelling and Apollodorus's account, and the evidence of the Locrian Pennicase, and the Defictiones, and the architectural remains at Eleusis, and the fragments of commentaries, and the marginal notes of ancient scholars who noted the variant versions and tried to reconcile them, and in all of these forms it carries the same structure at its center, descent and return, binding and release, a figure who moves between the two realms because she belongs to both of them, not because she was forced to accept the division. Exactly, though the tradition acknowledges the coercion that initiated it, but because the division, once made, became hers. The underworld was the realm she had been brought to, and then it was the realm she governed, and then it was the realm she descended to, of her own motion each year, carrying the bond the seeds had made into the dark that was already familiar. The grain, in the meantime, did what it has always done. It emerged from the soil in the same small, unhurried way it emerges every year. Pale at first, barely visible, bending slightly under the resistance of the earth it was pushing through, then straightening as it found the light, then greening in that particular vivid way that only green things in early spring achieve, when the color is at its most saturated, because the world around it is still at its most bare. field by field, across the whole of the cultivated ground, the pale threads appeared at the surface of the dark soil, each one very small, each one precise and unhurried, each one doing exactly the thing it was made to do, for exactly the reason the tradition said it did it. In the season that the tradition said was the consequence of a return that had already happened somewhere below, in the dark, in the palace at the center of the earth, where the queen had paused long enough to eat a few small seeds from a fruit she already knew the taste of, before rising through all the levels of the world to take up the other half of what she had become. The shoots are still there, in the fields, in the earliest days of the season, when the cold has just begun to ease, and the soil is still dark with winter's water. They emerge at the same pace they have always emerged, at the same fragile angle, in the same pale color that will deepen as the days lengthen. The story that explains them has been moving through the world for more than 2,500 years. From the poet who first wrote the hymn down in its surviving form, through the scribes who copied it, and the scholars who argued over its details, and the initiates who moved through the mysteries in silence and carried what they encountered there without words for the rest of their lives. The pomegranate still grows in late summer and ripens in early autumn. The ground still closes over itself each year and refuses, for a time, to yield. And in the season when it opens again, when the first pale shoots break the dark surface of the soil and begin their slow upward movement toward the light, the tradition says what it has always said, that she has come back, that the return is as real as the descent.